Welcome to this first session of the New England Biography series this academic year, sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Kanasorn Wongsu-Chanlai. I'm the Director of Research at the MHS. And before I go any further, I'd like to thank the members of the steering committee for this series. They are Professors Megan Marshall, Natalie Dykstra, and our special guest today, Julie Dobrow. Thank you all for bringing these wonderfully engaging and enlightening conversations to the Massachusetts Historical Society. And check our calendar for the upcoming programs in the series. They are going to be wonderful. The New England Biography series is part of a lineup of programs organized by the research department at the MHS. Most of the sessions in the other 6 series revolve around works in progress. So these are workshops of papers, of chapters, of dissertation pieces that have yet to be published. This series, however, is different in that it generally revolves around a book, a work that has been completed. Each program in the series engages biographers in deep conversations about their subjects, as well as about the craft of writing a biography. Today, Dr. Dobrow will speak briefly about the 2 key individuals in her book, introducing our audiences to them. She will then be joined in conversation by Professor Philip Deloria. Around 5:55 p.m., we are going to take questions from the audience. If you are in the room, simply raise your hand, and one of our staff members, most likely me, will bring the microphone to you. If you are joining us online, simply type your question into the Q&A box, and Cassie Cloutier, our Assistant Director of Research, will read them on your behalf. And we're going to wrap up here at about 6:15 p.m. on the East Coast. All right, let's get to the introductions. We are thrilled to have, as the first presenter in this series this year, Julie Dobrow. She is the director of the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies at Tufts University, where she also holds faculty positions in the Elliott Pearson Department of Child Study and Human Development, the Film and Media Studies program, and the Civic Studies program. She is the author of After Emily, 2 Remarkable Women and the Legacy of America's Greatest Poet, a dual biography of Mabel Loomis Todd and Millicent Todd Bingham. She is here to discuss her latest dual biography, and we are thrilled that she has selected the MHS to have this book launch event. Her current research project focuses on women abolitionists in the 19th century, examining the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society and some of the fascinating and diverse women who are part of that organization. Aside from serving on the steering committee for this series, she is also president of the Boston Authors Club. Professor Dobrow will be in conversation with Philip J. Deloria, the Leverett Saltonstall Professor of History at Harvard University, where he teaches courses on social, cultural, and political histories of the relations among American Indian peoples and the United States. He is the author of numerous works, including the books Playing Indian, which traces the tradition of white Indian play, Indians in Unexpected Places, which noted how Native Americans challenged white views of Indians through sports, travel, and the visual and performing arts. Also, Becoming Mary Sully, Toward an American Indian Abstract, which he discussed in this very series, in this very room, probably in the same seats he's in right now.
Actually, in the opposite seat.
Opposite, yes, very good. That volume looked at a Native American artist who was not widely known. It also explores American Indian visual arts in the middle of the 20th century. He co-authored other books as well, including the Blackwell Companion to American Indian History. Professor Deloria has served as a trustee of the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian. He has also been president of the American Studies Association, the Organization of American Historians, and the Society of American Historians. He's an elected member of the American Philosophical Society and an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society. Welcome to you both. And first, congratulations, Professor Julie Dobrow.
Thank you, Kid. And thanks to all of you for coming today. And thanks to all of you who are joining us on Zoom. Special shout out to family and friends who I know are joining us from near and far. And thank you, Phil, for joining me today. This really feels like a full circle moment in more than one way. So, because very few people know about Ohíye'Sa, Charles Alexander Eastman, and Elaine Goodale Eastman, and because none of you have had the opportunity to read the book yet, but I hope you will, we thought it might be a good idea to give you a short introduction to them. Like many Dakota, Charles Alexander Eastman had at least two names that were given to him at two different times of his life, as well as the Euro-American name that he took on when he was a teenager. But he never fully let go of his second Dakota name, Ohíye'Sa. And to me, as a biographer, this became an important clue into who he really was. As you will see, one of the most amazing things about Ohíye'Sa, Charles, and Elaine is that they ever met in the first place. Elaine Goodale was born on a farm in the remotest part of the Berkshires in 1863. She and her three siblings were homeschooled by their mother at the elegiacally named Sky Farm. As a child, Elaine and one of her sisters showed a remarkable facility with words. She began publishing poetry in the widely disseminated St. Nicholas magazine when she was only 13 years old. Her first book of poetry was published in 1878. This book received great acclaim, sold 10,000 copies, and went through 5 editions. Elaine and her sister Dora became widely known as the poetic prodigies of the Berkshires. But even poetic prodigies needed to make a living, especially if they were female. And so Elaine followed the path of so many other women in the 19th century who had few career options, and she became a teacher. But rather than teach in the little one-room schoolhouse in Mount Washington, Elaine traveled to Virginia to join the bold experiment started by General Samuel Chapman Armstrong at the Hampton Institute, teaching emancipated Black children and Native American children in a program of assimilation. Elaine fell in love with her Native American charges, and she traveled to the Dakota Territory in 1884 to better understand her students. She also learned their language, and she decided that the boarding school model was not a good one. Learning, she thought, would be more impactful if it happened in the communities in which the students lived. So she got permission to start a day school in White River, South Dakota, and along with Laura Tileston, whose papers are here at MHS, they started a school. The articles that Elaine wrote about her experiences helped to give her a national profile about Indian education and eventually led to her appointment as the first supervisor of education for the Dakotas. It was in this capacity that she traveled to Pine Ridge in December of 1890. Ohíye'Sa was born somewhere near Redwood Falls, Minnesota in 1858. His early years were marked by tragedy and displacement. His mother died shortly after giving birth to him. His family was scattered by the Dakota War of 1862. He fled to Manitoba along with his grandmother, uncle, and other surviving relatives. But in fact, it was believed that his father and brothers were believed killed in the largest mass execution in American history. Now there's the but. But it turned out that his father was imprisoned, not killed. And in 1873, he showed up in Canada to reclaim his youngest son. At this point, Jacob Eastman, as he was now calling himself, was convinced that the only path forward for Native Americans was to cut their hair, learn English, and become educated in Euro-American ways. So Ohíye'Sa became Charles Alexander Eastman and embarked on a series of boarding schools and preparatory programs. This eventually landed him at Dartmouth College, where he was the only Native American in his class. Charles's college career was marked by many things, including becoming widely known as Dartmouth's Indian. The college often invited him back after he graduated, where he often dressed in Sioux regalia, and his portrait was painted twice and hangs in the Hood Museum. After Dartmouth, Charles went on to the Boston University Medical School, where he was once again the only Native person in his class. Wanting to give back to his people, Charles's first job out of medical school was as agency physician at the Pine Ridge Agency in South Dakota. When Charles arrived in Pine Ridge, the situation was tense. A series of treaties broken with the US government had shunted the Sioux onto ever smaller reservations. Disease and poverty were rampant. In the increasingly desperate situation, the Sioux, like many other Plains groups, turned to the revivalist ghost dance as a way of connecting with their dearly departed and thinking that they could possibly get back to a time before the Euro-American incursions had changed their lives so dramatically. However, the Euro-Americans did not see the ghost dance as a ritual. They saw it as a threat. And they called in the troops. It was the largest military deployment since the Civil War, with fully a third of the US Army stationed near Pine Ridge. The press, sniffing a conflict in the offing, also gathered nearby. It was here, amidst these rising tensions, that Charles and Elaine met. These two young people who had come from such vastly different worlds were drawn together powerfully, and they fell in love. Just 3 weeks after they met, they announced their engagement under the Christmas tree. And then, just 4 days later, they heard the booming sounds of the Hotchkiss rifles, signaling what would become known later as the Wounded Knee Massacre. Charles's BU medical training had not prepared him for such a scene of mass casualties. Elaine, too, was called into service as a nurse, as the pair desperately, often futilely, tried to save some of the victims. Wounded Knee was an experience that was burned indelibly into their hearts and minds.
Well, Julie, let me begin by congratulating you on this lovely, fascinating, important, powerful book. It really tells what I think is a sort of quintessential story, a foundational story, one that has been hidden and buried. And your excavation of it allows us to think about things that we haven't really been able to think about before. I was really lucky to write a bit of an introduction, and I tried to frame this around a couple of very famous but equally challenging sorts of intermarriages. The marriage between Elias Parker, Seneca leader, and Minnie Sackett, who was a sort of Washington socialite. This is the period right after the Civil War. But also the marriage of my native grandfather, Vine Deloria Sr., and my grandmother, who was also a sort of white colonial family. I tried to draw a distinction between like a Civil War-ish moment and an early 20th century moment. And what I was sort of suggesting, and what your book actually tells us, I think, is the ways in which this marriage and the public nature of this marriage actually transforms and changes things for so many people. You and I have talked about this book for a long time, and it's so great to see it come to fruition. And one of the things that we've talked about is the fact that this is a very, very long and deep project for you, that you've had on your plate for, 4-ish decades. And so my first question to you then is to sort of maybe walk us through a little bit of your trajectory, how this book itself is a coming full circle for you in another kind of way, and where it all started.
Sure. Well, it all started for me the summer after my junior year of college, when I had a job in the Sophia Smith Women's History Archive at Smith College. And my main job that summer was to sort a new tranche of papers that the collection had received from the Goodale Eastman family. These were completely unsorted papers. They were just in these big cardboard boxes, and they weren't in any sort of order at all. My job was to go through them and start to put some organization to them. And as I took out these papers, this amazing story just literally leapt off the pages to me. There were old newspaper clippings, there were some photographs that were fraying at the edges, there were some old letters, and I was completely entranced. I decided that Elaine Goodale Eastman was one of the most remarkable women that I had come across. And I just thought it was a fascinating story, and I wanted to learn more. So I ended up writing my senior thesis about her. And then after I graduated from college, I wrote a couple of articles that I published about her, and then I went on to other topics. But there were still a lot of unanswered questions that I had. And fast forward several decades, we won't say how many, I was searching around for what would become the subject of my second biography after Emily. And my then editor and then agent advised me that my next biography really should be of somebody more famous than my first one had been. And I thought about that a lot, and I thought, does the world really need another biography of a famous person? There's so many amazing unfamous people whose stories are yet to be told. And I kept finding myself drawn back to the Eastmans. And so I decided that that was going to be the subject of my next biography, even though that meant I needed to find a new agent and a new editor. But it was totally worth it.
You've just used the word biography in the singular, but both of your books actually deal with multiple people. And I'm wondering, as a person who thinks a lot about biography, about the distinctions in your own practice between sort of writing about multiple people. Is it the case that the Eastman's marriage becomes sort of the object, or that you're running parallel biographies? And how is it different from writing sort of something that has a singular focus on a single person?
Well, I've never done one of a single person. So I'm not sure I can answer that part of your question, but in both of the biographies that I've done, I have felt very strongly that people need to be understood in concert with other people. Mm-hmm. And although I started with a much better understanding of Elaine Goodale than of Charles Eastman, as I started to get into this, I realized I could not tell her story without telling his story, or at least without trying to tell his story. And similarly, his story couldn't really be told without telling hers. And so as this idea for this book developed, I realized that I needed to try to tell both of their stories individually, but also together. And so in many ways, it did become a biography of a marriage, a very challenging marriage. And I thought that you had to have both perspectives in order to try to understand what happened.
I mean, one of the things that's been most enjoyable for me in our conversations over the last few years has been watching you sort of like gain the expertise and the confidence to write about Charles Eastman, who is, a major iconic figure in Native American studies. And within Native American studies, there are certain debates about Charles Eastman. I've had students say like, oh, I can't believe looking at him in his suit and his tie and he seems so assimilated. And it's like, dude, if Charles Eastman walked in this room, we are not worthy to be in his company, right? This is the kind of person that he is. So that this marriage doesn't last. It's worth sort of noting that. And maybe we can talk a little bit about some of the things that are coming up between them meeting and marrying, and the dissolution of the marriage. I mean, one of the things is that they're both writers. And Eastman starts to become, surprisingly prolific. We know that, that she has an early career, an successful early career as a writer. And they've got these sort of, as you can imagine, a household of two writers, right? I mean,
And 6 kids.
Yeah. That too. So there's some sense of, maybe it's a little bit of mystery, right? About sort of who's doing what and how things get passed back and forth and how ideas are flowing. And I wonder maybe if you could walk us through a little bit about what we know or what you've discovered about their sort of editorial and writerly lives.
So you're quite right, Phil. There's a lot of controversy about that. And I'm not sure if my book is going to do anything more than help to fuel these controversies. But Elaine did start out as the writer in the family. In addition to being the childhood poetic prodigy of the Berkshires, when she became a teacher and a school administrator, she became a journalist, and she was writing all of these articles that she sent back east that were published in all of the leading newspapers and magazines of the day. And she had developed quite a platform for herself as a spokesperson on Indian education and Indian policy. And she prided herself very much on being a writer. I think that was really a core part of her identity. And then when she became a mom, like so many other women, she had to turn her attention elsewhere, especially because Charles was on the road a lot. And Elaine was tasked with sole care of their children and their household. So she wasn't able to write as much as she had been. And that was really a source of frustration for her. She still occasionally churned out these poems or the occasional article, mostly for money. Money was a big source of tension in their marriage. It was always very, very tight. And Charles had a series of different sorts of jobs. After he had quit being an agency physician and they moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, he tried to hang up a shingle as a doctor in private practice, but it wasn't very successful because white patients didn't want to go to a quote unquote Indian doctor, and Native patients were very suspicious of an Indian doctor who was doling out Western medications. So he wasn't very successful in that practice either. And by this time, the Eastmans had 3 children, all under the age of 5, and a lot of expenses. They needed money. And so Elaine started encouraging Charles to write down some of the stories of his Sioux boyhood, as she put it. And they sold these to St. Nicholas magazine, where Elaine still had really good connections. And one thing turned into another, and some of these stories turned into a book that did very well. And the Eastmans then saw that this was going to be a source of income for them if he could keep writing these books. Now, the controversy comes in how much did he write and how heavy an editorial hand did she actually have in these manuscripts? And there is a lot of debate about this in extant sources. I tried to dig into this as well. And I have to say that in the end, I'm a little bit on the fence. I do think that Elaine played a pretty significant role in shaping his manuscripts. But I've read enough of the Indigenous scholarship to know that there are some things about his writing which really read Indigenous. And there are things that she probably couldn't have put in herself that really must have come from him. Now, the other controversial thing is that after they parted, he never published another thing. And there are some people who have suggested that he never published anything else because he really needed her editorial help. And it's not clear to me if that's the only reason that he never published again, but it is certainly one of them. She, on the other hand, became a very prolific writer after they split up. She published some things that she called, somewhat disparagingly, she called her pot boilers. These were fiction that she created for sale, but she knew they weren't great literature. She also tried her hand at a number of different other genres, including writing plays. She wrote a biography. She also wrote a memoir, and she tried to write a number of different other sorts of things as well, essays, and she continued to publish very prolifically in newspapers until she was well into her 70s.
Mm-hmm. There's such a sad irony about, Charles Eastman, in the sense that, from the very beginning, white Americans are pushing Native people to assimilate. And the thought that assimilation means you go to school and you get an education and you do wear a suit and you become a medical doctor. And you would think that that would sort of be the pillar of this kind of assimilative, kind of life. But in fact, what it does is positions him in such a way that he actually cannot have a professional career. So the Indian service becomes one of the possibilities for him. This writerly kind of enterprise becomes another thing, and he knocks around a bit more. But there's also the sort of elements of this where it is a Massachusetts story in kind of surprising ways, particularly, in the sort of, teens period, I guess, was so how I would think about it. So maybe you can kind of take us into some of the things that are happening here, not in Boston per se, but in Massachusetts.
Sure. So, well, obviously, Charles went to medical school here in Boston, and he retained ties to this area and came back and spoke very frequently at some of the churches in Boston. Boston was also a real hotbed for white activists who were passionate about Indian causes. And both Charles and Elaine were people who were often called upon to come and speak for the Boston Indian Committee and a number of other organizations that were here very close to where we are right now, actually. And in addition, this is a Massachusetts story because the Eastmans lived in Amherst for about 20 years. And Amherst was also, interestingly, a place where there was a lot of many people who were affiliated with Amherst College, were passionate about Indian causes. Amherst College had two presidents who would sort of dip their toes and their hands into Indian organizations in a number of different ways. And so when the Eastmans moved to Amherst, they also became involved in speaking about Indian causes in Western Massachusetts as well.
And I have to ask you to fill in one more little detail about Massachusetts, which is the summer camp, which is the camp.
Well, it wasn't in Massachusetts. It was nearby. It was in New Hampshire.
In New Hampshire, yeah. Because to me, this is one of these sort of fascinating moments where Eastman, it's not by coincidence that St. Nicholas, right, which is this a magazine that we've sort of forgotten about, but a very, very important magazine in terms of child raising and youth culture, right, in the United States at the time. It's also then the sort of moment of the efflorescence of the summer camp and the camp and things like that. And Eastman, as they are willing to sort of dive into some of this children's literature, they're also willing to dive into this camp thing. And to me, it's always a really interesting part of their story.
It is. So in the early part of the 20th century, the American camping movement took off. And along with it was the idea that if you had a camp that used Indian themes, that this was going to be something that would be very popular. There was this whole sort of back to nature thing, and many white people thought that Indian people were somehow closer to nature, and that this was a way that you could get away from the increasing industrialization of the early 20th century. And what better to do than send your kids off to a summer camp? And if you happen to have a camp director who himself was Native American, really authentic. So the Eastmans decided that they were going to tap into this, and which they initially saw as another way of bringing in some much needed income. But in fairness, I have to say that Charles in particular really truly saw this as an opportunity to teach white girls about Native cultures in a way that he thought would be important to try to impart some important Indigenous values to the mothers of tomorrow. And so this is the way the Eastmans advertised their camp, which was called Camp Ohíye'Sa, which was up in Munsonville, New Hampshire, along Granite Lake. They rented a property there. And they recruited a cohort of girls. The first summer, it was very successful. They decided, if we could do this once, we can do it again, and we can expand, and expand they did. And so they had a pretty successful camp there until 1918.
I mean, one of the stories that comes out of the late teens is the death of their daughter, which to me is always one of the saddest and most sort of poignant kind of moments. You know, a singer of great talent. So perhaps you can maybe kind of walk us through a little bit of what that looks like, and their children, right, who become quite interesting people in their own right.
Yes, well, so I mentioned the Eastmans had 6 children, 5 daughters and 1 son. Their second daughter, Irene Toluta, was an incredibly talented soprano. And one of the things the Eastmans were struggling with financially was how to give Irene lessons. But they were able to scrape together enough money to get her lessons. And she eventually went off to New York to pursue a singing career. Irene was really interesting also because she was one of the first real crossover singers, I have to say. She was equally talented in singing Native American traditional songs and also Western operatic repertoire. And in fact, Irene often traveled around the country with her father, and she was the opening act. She would sing, he would talk, she would sing again. In 1918, of course, all of us may remember hearing about 1918 more recently, because that 1918 was the year that the influenza epidemic swept the United States, and at least 675,000 people died of the flu. One of those people, tragically, was Irene Toluta, who was only 23 years old, and she had just traveled back to Munsonville to tell her parents that she had been accepted by the Metropolitan Opera. Irene was extremely close to both of her parents, and it was just a horrible, horrible tragedy when she died. And their marriage, which was already pretty much fraying at the seams, broke apart after this. I think that it's very hard for us to imagine, very hard for me as a mom to imagine what it would be like to lose a child. And for Elaine and for Charles, it was a horrible experience. And rather than turn to each other in this moment of tragedy, they turned apart.
I mean, it's I in the past, have written about the Native musical performers of those periods. Chanina Blackstone, Princess Watawasso. There's quite a number of people who do this, and men and women both, who do exactly. I mean, it's a genre performance, right? In some ways, it's like, I will now sing Western opera with precision and power, and now I'll sing native songs, and also this sort of kind of multimedia Chautauqua-esque kind of performance where, like, now we'll do a lecture about Indian music. And now, so it's this sort of, so many people were engaged in this kind of thing. The Eastman's probably as successful at it as anyone. You know, one of the things that's interesting to me is when we look at Elaine Goodale in the beginning, you know, she looks very progressive. You know, the boarding school is not the way to do things. We should take people into day schools, and there's a transition that happens, but she's very, very early in thinking about day schools. You know, the classic Native American boarding school maintains its sort of power and authority well deep into the 20th century. It's not until the 1930s or so, with the kind of reforms of the New Deal, the Indian New Deal, that you start to get more day schools, more students living at home, you know, and a kind of a bit of a de-emphasis on this. So she's thinking way ahead, you know, in terms of those things. So she feels progressive when we sort of engage her early years and thinking about Native American sorts of issues. But one of the things that's really interesting in this book is the ways that, like, by the end of her life, we can only read her as being very, very conservative. And I'm wondering if you can sort of, like, help us understand, you know, is that about sort of her as a person? Is it about the context changing? Like, how do we see her near the end of her life in relation to the way she's been thinking about Native people?
Yeah. I think this was one of the things that when I discovered her as a 20-year-old, and I just thought, this is so cool. This woman who goes out to the Dakota Territory by herself, and she learns how to speak the language there, and she's teaching children in their communities. And it just seemed amazingly progressive to me. And Phil, you're quite right. You know, towards the end of her life, we don't see that so much anymore. But I think what I learned in doing this research is that in spite of some of her more progressive stances, she really believed in the cult of assimilation. She never, ever thought otherwise. I mean, this is why she was recruited to teach at the Hampton Institute. This is why she was recruited to be at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. She believed that even though she thought there was value in Native culture, that the best thing that Native Americans could do going forward would be to become as much like white people as possible. And she never let go of that belief. And as she got older, she held onto it more firmly, perhaps. Many people do as they get older. And I think that in the end, this was the major thing out of a lot of different problems that they had in their marriage. But this was the thing that really killed the marriage, that she never saw Charles for who he truly was. She never understood his Dakota self. She never understood that this was a really important part of who he was. And for his part, I think he was able to get by. He did really well in the different Euro-American settings that he was in. But he was who he was, and you know, sort of most eloquently stated, perhaps, in From the Deep Woods to Civilization, where he talks about, it's probably the most quoted line of anything that he wrote, where he wrote about how I'm an Indian first, but I'm an American. And different people have interpreted that line in different ways. The way I interpreted it is to say, he most of all, in his true self, his core self, he is an Indian, and she never understood that. And you mentioned the children. This is another great tragedy of the Eastman's marriage, in my opinion. I don't think Elaine ever acknowledged that the children were biracial. She listed them as white on the 1910 census. She dressed them up in Euro-American clothing for Christmas portraits that they had taken. She wrote letters to her sister late in life where she was talking about, well, I never really saw any Indian traits in my children. And I think she never acknowledged the fact that her own 6 children were biracial and how hurtful that must have been to Charles as well as to the children.
Yeah. I mean, you know, one way to think about this question of identity is that, like, I've got a core identity. It's a thing that sits there. It gets performed and demonstrated, right? Another way to think about it is, no, I'm actually constituted as a person by the things that I do and the performances and the situations that I'm in, right? And that, so there's a, so one way to think about Eastman is that, like, he's got this Dakota core. But I wonder about the other way to think about it, right? Which is that, like, he's writing all these books. He's doing all these performances. He's putting on his headdress. He is constantly sort of like representing Dakota-ness and his Dakota identity, right, out there in the world. It is kind of the traffic in Dakota-ness that, like, actually sort of gets him going. So I wonder if there's a sort of irony that the writing and the things that actually allowed them to survive in a monetary, you know, kind of way are also strengthening his own sense of his identity. I mean, I wonder if you get that sense out of it, or
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that he was very well aware of the fact that anytime he went out to do a lecture wearing his Sioux regalia, that people loved it. And in fact, one of my major sources of information for this book, where it was retrieving the hundreds and hundreds of articles that were written in newspapers of the day, many newspapers that are no longer being published, but fortunately, we have newspapers.com. And it was a great source of information for me. One of the really interesting things was that the articles that talked about Charles's lectures were really bifurcated. When he was wearing Sioux outfits, that would be the headline. That would be the substance of the article. Oftentimes, they wouldn't even talk about what he talked about. Whereas when he was wearing a suit and tie, they would discuss the substance of what was being said. So one of the things that I think I learned about Charles Eastman was that this was an incredibly brilliant man who had a wickedly sly sense of humor and a sense of irony. And I'm sure that the coverage that he received was not lost on him. He knew how to monetize it. That was really important for them because they needed the money. But I think you're right, Phil, that this also reinforced his Dakota-ness for him in a way that was very central to who he was, and in a way that Elaine refused to acknowledge and never understood.
Yeah. You know, it's also something that you see with Native folks a fair bit. I think of my own grandfather, that a lot of times these folks who are so, you know, fluid and moving through the world and confronting all these awful kinds of episodes of discrimination and get past them and do these amazing kind of wonderful things. As they age out of that cross-cultural thing, and they turn and sort of think like, no. It's in the latter part of my life, I'm going to become more Indian and less engaged with this kind of cross-cultural kinds of things. So it feels like this may be a dynamic that Charles Eastman was also going through.
Yeah, I think so.
So one of the things that's interesting then is if we turn back to the archives and back to Smith, and one of the things you've talked to me about is the sort of sense of that Elaine may have destroyed records. And so the sense in which, like, I have an archive and I'm going to manage that archive very tightly, and I'm going to do certain things and allow certain things to appear and certain other things to not appear. So the sourcing here is really interesting, right? He has a lot of published works, but very few things in the sense of papers. She's got this rich trove, but it's actually been altered, in some way. So I'm wondering if you could maybe take us back into the archive and help us think through what Elaine might have been thinking as she was watching her papers and her legacy.
Yeah, so this was a big challenge for me in this book because Phil is quite right. With Charles Eastman, there wasn't very much to go on other than his published works. And there, to be sure, there were quite a few of them, but he left behind very few personal papers. Elaine, on the other hand, left behind a fair bit, but she curated it very, very carefully. In fact, in the collection at Smith College, which is one of their larger collections, there is not a single photograph of this much storied wedding, which reports of which appeared in more than 200 papers across the country and actually around the world. But she took out all the photographs. She took out all the mentions of the wedding. She took out almost every mention of the marriage. There is very little about him that is in that archive, aside from things that were published in newspapers that she clipped out. And the thing that actually became a great source of information for me was something that Elaine didn't know was going to be given to the Sophia Smith collection. And these were letters that she wrote to her youngest sister, Rose, who was a dear correspondent for Elaine for much of her life. And in these letters to Rose, Elaine opens up quite a lot about her marriage, about her children, about her disappointments in life, about the ways that she was disappointed in herself, in her career. And these are, I thought, really the best unfiltered pieces of information, because this is Elaine talking to her dear sister, and she didn't know that Rose's family was going to give these letters to the collection someday. For her own part, Elaine destroyed the letters that Rose wrote to her. So when you read the other side of the correspondence, you can infer some of the questions that Rose was putting to her big sister, but those letters don't exist anymore. So it was a real lesson to me as a biographer about where you have to go to try to get to the heart of a story, and sometimes how you have to triangulate to be able to tell this story.
Also a lesson for all of us who are donating our papers somewhere, perhaps to the Massachusetts Historical Society, right? That someone, when we try to curate, someone is going to undercut us, in a particular kind of way. My father started curating his archive in the 1960s. And anytime he got a letter, he would write his response with a carbon, and he would staple the carbon to the original, and he would put it in a file folder. And if you wrote him 2 or 3 times, you would get your own named folder. Otherwise, you were in a chronological correspondence kind of thing. So there's an archive that actually had so much intentionality, attached to it. We could only be so fortunate, right, to work in those kinds of archives. But just to sort of put a little cherry on the top of that, my dad also wrote what he called an autobiography. And he at one point pulled me aside and said, after I'm gone, you're going to find my autobiography in the papers. And it's going to be very valuable. Go get an agent in New York and sell it. It will take care of your mom. And then what he did, my dad had well over 100 boxes worth of materials. He put these things in unmarked file folders and scattered them throughout the papers so that I had to go through the papers 3 times with a fine-tooth comb to find the autobiography, which is completely unpublishable. But what it meant was, yes, I know it was quite disappointing in that sense, but what it meant was I ended up curating his archive for him. And I did not pull out that much stuff, but I pulled out stuff, right, that a son can do for a father, right? And so there's also these other dimensions, right, to thinking about how an archive gets curated. One of the things that is so striking to me is that, this is in some ways this kind of the marriage of the late 19th century when it comes to Native America. But it's a marriage that, as you pointed out, is really born out of trauma. And, as we have thought more about the ways in which trauma is carried with people, is sometimes moved across generations. I'm wondering if Wounded Knee, if in your research, if you found that Wounded Knee kind of just kept reappearing, if that moment of union and trauma that was mixed together was some sort of defining thing in their life, or whether it was repressed and pushed down, and how Wounded Knee sort of plays into the story.
It's a great question. So I think it was both for them. Again, with Charles, we don't have very much to go on. He didn't, aside from he wrote 2 autobiographical books. The second one is called From the Deep Woods to Civilization. And that book had the longest chapter in that book is about Wounded Knee. So just the bulk of it there, I think, gives you some sense of what a foundational experience that was for him in so many ways, and how frustrating that must have been for him as someone who had gone to medical school with the idea of helping his people, to be placed in this horribly traumatic situation where he couldn't really help. And I think that was something that really must have made a deep, deep impression on him. And he didn't leave behind personal papers for us to know about that. Elaine also actually wrote about Wounded Knee quite a lot, and she wrote about it all the way up into the 1930s. So it was something that I think was just, must have been such a horrific experience for both of them. I sort of imagine in the book that the 2 of them must have experienced post-traumatic stress from this experience, but we don't know because they didn't leave behind the personal papers to tell us about it. So if there were nightmares that they had, if there were times when they woke up in a cold sweat, if there were times when there was some sound that brought them back to that sound of the Hotchkiss rifles, we don't know about it. What we do know from the psychiatric literature is that post-traumatic stress syndrome is something that is widely experienced, probably way more than we know, because we only know about the reported cases. And we also know that Native Americans and other people of color tend to experience more post-traumatic stress. So I've got to think that this was an experience that lived with them in very unsettling ways for their entire lives.
So, they have so many kids, and the kids are going to have kids. And this is one of the things that when we're doing Native American history, we have to think about families and genealogies and things like that. And I'm wondering sort of like how the fact that there are descendants out there has played into the research and the book and the conversations.
Well, honestly, I wish it had played into the conversation more. I would love to be in touch with Eastman descendants, and I have tried to be in touch with some. I'm hoping that now that the book is out in the world, that I will be in touch with more. I'm quite sure that there are many valuable stories that descendants have that I don't know, experiences, family stories that I don't know. I did have an opportunity to meet 2 of Elaine and Charles's daughters after I had graduated from college, and they were quite elderly at the time, but they were still living in Northampton. And I tracked them down and I went to see them. I think I was probably a little starstruck. And I wish that I had a tape recorder with me. I wish that I had asked them many questions that I would have asked them if I had the opportunity to speak to them today. But, maybe there are these stories that have been passed along in the Eastman family. And I think that, the stories of both Charles and Elaine are really important stories. And I hope that they will be more told and told in different ways than I've told it.
I mean, it feels like the book can be a wonderful catalyst for thinking
I
about,
hope so.
ways for us to really elevate this story, which is quite extraordinary. One of the other things that you did along the way in the book was to sort of, I think, try to be attentive to places. You went out to Pine Ridge and thought about that. So I'm wondering a bit about how place makes its way
Sure.
into the book.
Well, I think for many biographers, this footstepping, literally going and walking where your subjects have walked and seeing where they lived and trying to see the places that they worked are really important. And I did try to go to a lot of the places that Elaine and Charles went to. I went out to Minnesota and saw some of the places that they had lived. I went to in South Dakota as well. I think, really the single most moving place that I went to was to go to Pine Ridge and to sort of see what is there at Wounded Knee now. And it's, I was there with my family on a day when it was really, really hot. The thermometer in the car reached 107 degrees. And the cemetery for many of the Wounded Knee victims is up on this hill. And I walked up on the hill and the heat was just radiating off the pavement. It was so hot. But because it was so hot, there was nobody else there. And it was just an amazingly silent place. And it was a place, it made me think of Dee Brown's book, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, because of course there's so many hearts that are buried there. And it was such a moving place to sort of be there in front of that cemetery where people had put prayer flags around. And I felt that the silence that day was probably not unlike the silence of the day in December 1890 and the days afterwards when there was a huge blizzard and the snow blanketed the sound. And for me, this was really just an incredibly moving experience to go there, as well to see what's in Pine Ridge today. It is an incredibly impoverished area of the United States. And I thought that Elaine and Charles, if they had seen it today, I wondered if they would be surprised. And I thought, no, they probably wouldn't be surprised. They probably would say that they had tried to send up flares and that they would know that their warnings had gone unheeded.
Well, with that quite lovely and poignant recollection, I think it's a good indication of how beautifully the book is written. The fact, Julie, that you speak in that way about this very, very, very difficult and challenging place, which is the sort of root of this really, really interesting and wonderful marriage. And I believe it's time then for us to move to some questions from the audience.
Thank you. You were talking a lot about their perception of the Indian background, et cetera. But I was wondering, I know the Loving case, interracial marriage in the Supreme Court, I think was 1947, which would have been quite a number of years later. How did the communities that they lived in, were they accepted, into the clubs, or did they have to live kind of on their own because they didn't really fit into either community?
So I think that the Eastmans face a lot of prejudice during their time. And that was one of the things that became very apparent to me, especially in reading newspaper articles where the descriptions of Charles in particular were in highly racialized ways. And often contrasted the way Elaine looked with the way that Charles looked. And I think that's something that really probably played into their relationship as well. Another really unfortunate thing about the children that I didn't mention is that their kids were also sort of the victims of highly racialized language that appeared in the press, which, you know, you've got to think that any protective parent would have been just aghast to see the way their kids were portrayed in the press.
One more question in the room, then we'll go online.
After listening to all the conversation, I feel like in some ways it's the story of lost identities. I think there's a story behind the story, as you said, like almost a sequel, because I guess it would now be the grandchildren because their children are deceased or great-grandchildren, to get more of the story. But in the exuberance of Elaine, it's Elaine, right? The protagonist in the story. In that story, it's the Carlisle School and the Dawes Severalty Act, and I'm sure she read Helen Hunt Jackson's Century of Dishonor and the assimilation, and I think she was living that and progressive, as you said, but as time went on, and the Indian New Deal in the 1930s, and she saw what this meant for her family as well as others, that she probably, yes, became much more conservative, but it seems like she started out with a certain young, exuberant identity and kind of transitioned or lost that. And he, on the other hand, Charles, in that period in history also, he was excited and wanted to be successful in American society. And then in some ways, it seems like he lost his identity. And as you said, even monetized it. And I don't think either one of them, from what I'm hearing, knew who they really were by the end of the story, which kind of makes me sad. But I think there's more of a story with the great-grandchildren.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I love the way you put that there are the stories behind the story. Yeah, and I do think that part of what was going on with Elaine was that she did see what was going on. She did see the prejudice all around, and she wanted to protect her children from that. That being said, I think I just really am very convinced that she didn't understand that there were other parts of her children's identities that she couldn't protect them from, and she shouldn't protect them from. That's who they were. And I do feel like that's part of the tragedy of this story.
Yep. One of our online attendees asks if you can talk more about how the divorce itself happened. Specifically, what were the legal and social obstacles that this couple faced?
So, so the Eastmans separated in 1921, but they never divorced. And there were, as I think I have suggested, there were many, many different things that led up to that moment. There was also another thing that I haven't talked about, and I actually don't want to talk about because I want you to read the book. But I would just say to try to stimulate your imagination that there was a point of no return for the Eastmans, and it actually kind of took on some soap opera like dimensions at the end, but it was there were a lot of things that led up to what happened in 1921.
I think we know what you're saying.
Yeah.
Thank you for this great program, and I'm wondering if you could, if you can characterize if there were differences between the way Charles and Elaine wrote about Wounded Knee, since they both did, or was that something on which they were kind of in accord?
There are differences between the ways that they wrote?
They wrote about them. You said that Charles wrote about Wounded Knee and then Elaine was writing about it still into the 1930s. Was it,
I'm not quite sure how I would characterize it, Megan, other than to say that when Elaine wrote about, not just about Wounded Knee, but when she wrote about all sorts of issues in Native American history and Native and American history. She continued to, on the one hand, evince some understanding and appreciation for different Native cultures, but on the other hand, took this really very hardline assimilationist tack and thought that it was incredibly important for Native peoples to speak English, to be well-versed in American politics and governance, and to get this really assimilationist sort of education. Charles didn't write about the same sorts of things that she wrote about. And so it's a little bit hard to compare them. And I think that in his writing about Wounded Knee, in the one place where he does write about it a lot, From the Deep Woods Civilization, he is mostly recounting the difficulties that he had in trying to save the victims and how he rode out into the snow in the days after the tragedy to try to see if there were any people that were still living. He did find some people who were still living, by the way, including a baby who remarkably had survived this blizzard in her mother's arms. The mother had painted the baby's face in red, white, and blue. And we don't know, of course, whether this was a way of protecting the baby or a way of sort of signaling to the 7th Cavalry that they should leave this baby alone. But that was a very poignant story that Charles told a little bit in From the Deep Woods Civilization. Elaine took that same story and she fictionalized it years later. She wrote a short story and then she wrote a whole novel that was based on this baby who was left in the snow and then subsequently adopted by white parents. And it is based on a true story. The child, of course, you know this story, right? Yeah, and the child, actually the real child, grew up to have this terrible life where she was probably abused by her stepfather. And but Elaine saw it in a very different way. And she saw that it was a good thing that this baby had been adopted by white parents. And that was the novel that she wrote. So it's interesting to see that one incident, I think, and to see some of the different ways that Charles and Elaine wrote about it.
Back online.
Can you tell us how the Goodale Eastman papers found their way to Smith College?
Elaine lived in Northampton. So she was very familiar with Smith College. One of her daughters, Dora, went to Smith College. And Elaine didn't get to go to college. She was very jealous of the fact that her siblings did get to go to college. So it's kind of interesting, actually, in the end, that Elaine decided to give the papers to Smith. I think it was more a function of the fact that she was familiar with the college and she knew that they had this women's history archive. And one of the things that Elaine prided herself on was she believed that she was a feminist. So whether or not she was, of course, another discussion that we could have at another time, certainly not by 21st century standards, but there were certainly many ways in which she was very proud of the things that she did as a woman.
Yes, earlier you said there is white Indian play. What is that? And the pictures, when you were saying since their wedding was very well published, is there not a way to go into like libraries or something to see if there are wedding pictures or anything like that?
So were there other newspaper coverage of the wedding was so extensive? Were there newspaper pictures of the wedding that might be accessed? And then sort of like defining Indian play.
Yeah, so the newspaper coverage is really interesting to take a look at. They didn't have very many photographs in newspapers in those days. There are some line drawings that you can see. When we get into the 20th century, there started to be a little bit more of the photographs that you would see. So there are a few that are there, but what I found to be actually more interesting than the images were actually some of the headlines and some of the descriptions that the writers of these articles had. There's some great articles that are about Camp Ohíye'Sa that with absolutely bizarre descriptions of the children who, the Eastman's children who were counselors at the camp. I mean, there are things that there is a headline in one where they talk about Mabel Great Cloud Eastman. Now, I don't know who that is because the Eastmans did not have a daughter named Mabel. But this was part of the ways that newspapers were covering the Eastmans their entire lives. Charles, who was very, very frequently mentioned in the press from the time that he was a student at Dartmouth on, there was just so much misinformation about him. Aside from the racialized descriptions that I've already mentioned, there were also huge amount of misinformation about where he went to college, where he went to medical school, the sorts of professional things that he did. And it almost didn't seem to matter in the press. What seemed to matter was that here was a Native American who had succeeded in this white America in different ways. You've written about that too. Maybe you can say something about that as well.
Yeah. So Julie's book makes a great holiday gift. But if you're looking for a second holiday gift, I wrote a book called Playing Indian. Yeah, actually, it's right there, which is about this kind of habit that white Americans have of dressing up and performing like American Indians. And I start that book with the Boston Tea Party, one of the great examples in American history of white people dressing up like Indians. But in this period, campfire girls dress up like Indians, Boy Scouts dress up like Indians. You know, the YMCA Indian guides dress up like Indians. You can go into the 19th century and find fraternal orders, the improved order of red men who dress up like Indians. And so part of the argument of that book is that there's this pervasive thread in American culture and American history of white people trying to claim a kind of aboriginal authority for themselves by setting up a kind of temporary ritual sort of practice of dressing up like Indians. Not to be confused with sort of going native, because many white Americans also, especially in the colonial period, sort of like to hang out with Indians. I mean, I hate to say it, Massachusetts people, as a Colorado and Michigan person myself, but like, if you're kind of hanging out here in the 17th century, you look at the Pilgrims over there and you look at sort of native folks, I think you go and hang out with the native folks.
And let's also talk about what you wrote about the Boston Tea Party, right?
Which
about white people dressing up as natives and the sort of inverse of this, because only natives would have the temerity to do what they did.
Yeah, I mean, the Boston Tea Party is so interesting, right? Because it fuses together old European rituals of misrule and the world turned upside down and social inversions and crossing certain kinds of borders in order to be illegal in the dark of night with a mask on, these kinds of things, right? So it takes those old rituals and it infuses them with this idea about Indian people being aboriginal to this continent. So it's this kind of incredible sort of identity claim. I mean, as we know, if you were sitting in Boston during the Tea Party, like you pretty much knew who most of these people were, right? These are the street gangs in the North and South Side. And, So the claim that these things are disguises, when in many cases the disguises were barely disguises, it's about the claim as much as it is about the disguise and about the Indian costume. And to say that like we are Mohawks is to make a certain kind of statement right in that moment. For folks who are interested in reading about settler colonial theory, and this may not be a moment in which we want to talk much about this, but this is actually one of the fundamental premises, is that you sort of appropriate, you sort of displace actual native people, and then you appropriate the idea of Indianness for yourself in order to claim a kind of aboriginal authority in relation to the land. So this is what we're meaning when we're talking about Indian play. What is also interesting then is the ways that becomes such a pervasive practice that Indian people themselves now start to play Indian for white audiences. And this is kind of one of the things
Which is what is so fascinating about Charles Eastman and the way that he would dress up for some of the audiences that he had. And so, we like to think that part of what he was doing there was sort of with a wink and a nod. The white audiences really didn't understand what he was doing.
It's a kind of a claim to be legible, right, for Native folks. There's a question back there.
Time for one last question.
Thank you. So Julie, thank you so much for writing this book. And I have to tell you, like when you first started talking, and I could just visualize you at Smith College looking through these archives, getting so jazzed about Elaine. And your emotion and your enthusiasm about that moment in your life was quite palpable. So then as you continue the story, then we see your fascination with Charles too. So my question, and this might not be fair, but I think it's a good question, is as you came to, after decades of, peeling the onion layers back on both of these two, who did you have the greatest fondness for?
So I'm not sure how to answer that question, Peggy. I think that what I try to do as a biographer is to see people as whole people, as flawed as we all are. And I certainly saw both Elaine and Charles's strengths and also their weaknesses. I always have felt like I've had a pretty good handle on who Elaine was. Although, as you correctly say, as a college student, I was completely enthralled and in love with her. And when I realized that she had these really conservative sides to her and always had, I was really disillusioned. And that was partly about who I am, I think, as much as sort of realizing this. And then, coming back to her story as an adult, I think I saw her in much more nuanced ways. I also understood her differently, being a mom myself, and being a writer myself, I think. And for Charles, I feel today like I have some sense of who Charles Eastman may have been. I'm humbled by the fact that I don't think I really understand Ohíye'Sa. And I had to be very conscious of my own positionality in trying to write about him. But yeah, I see both of them as fascinating, complicated, flawed individuals. And I like them both.
That's a great way to end. Thank you so much, Julie, for sharing your work with us. Thank you, Phil. Conversation. Folks, here at MHS, we have books for sale outside. Julie's happy to autograph them for you. And if you're joining us online, we encourage you to purchase a copy or multiple copies of the book at your local bookstore. Again, holiday season is coming up, but thank you so much, Julie. Congratulations.